The Constitutional Convention had a very bright group of men. They were all men with varied backgrounds, and a number of whom were born in foreign countries. There was one who was born in Ireland, one in Canada, one in New Zealand. Morris Goldwater, the uncle of Barry Goldwater, was born in London and became one of the founders of Goldwater's department store. Jacob Weinberger, who I've just mentioned, was born in the Czech Republic. A man by the name of George Pusch was born in Frankfurt, Germany, birthplace of my mother, many years later. And he became a butcher. Ed Tovria of Tovria Packing was one of the meat packing was one of the delegates to the convention. It was, by any standard, but particularly by comparing it with what we have in the legislature today, a very well educated and outstanding group.
Years ago, as a student at Phoenix College, I knew a political science and history professor named John Goff. Now, when Dr. Goff retired at about age 65, I thought it strange that he then enrolled in law school. What was he going to do with it? Well, he didn't really need to go to law school, but in the years that followed, he wrote and edited invaluable books on the legal and political history of Arizona. He wrote and published a 4-volume biographical history of the officers of Arizona Territory. But equally, he edited a 1,200-page volume of the proceedings of the 1910 Constitutional Convention, all of the proposals, ideas, and suggestions put forward at that convention. Obviously, we are not going to review this 1,200-page record, but the bottom line is that the convention was like a legislative session. There were individuals and committees that introduced proposals for inclusion in the Arizona Constitution. They were accepted, rejected, and amended. Let's run through the original 1910 Constitution and note just some of the particularly interesting and important parts of it. Article 1 describes the state boundaries. An interesting footnote is that modern-day Las Vegas, Nevada was originally part of Arizona Territory. But Nevada was already a state and had the political clout to get that land transferred to them.
So Las Vegas, there would have been no Las Vegas as we know it today, because there might have been another Las Vegas, but it would have been somewhere else. But it wouldn't have been called Las Vegas either.
Article 2 is called the Declaration of Rights, which first notes that Arizona must have a representative form of government and that the U.S. Constitution is supreme. After that, it includes the basic things covered by the U.S. Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, and numerous other things. Remember that the Arizona Constitution was written more than 100 years after the U.S. Constitution. Included, of course, is due process of law from the 5th and the 14th Amendments. The right to petition and of assembly, part of the First Amendment. Here's one that is interesting. Quote, every person may freely speak, write, and publish on all subjects, in quotes. That's in the Arizona Constitution. Yeah, that's from also the U.S. First Amendment, but Arizona adds the phrase, quote, being responsible for the abuse of that right, end quote. This gives recognition and authority to the laws on libel and slander. And here's another interesting difference between the Arizona and the U.S. Fourth Amendment regarding search and seizure. We've heard people argue that the U.S. Constitution never specifically mentions the word private or privacy. Arizona does. Quote, no person shall be disturbed in his private affairs or his home invaded without authority of law, end quote. Arizona Article 2, Section 10 protects against self-incrimination and double jeopardy. 11 guarantees a speedy trial. And hearkening back to the days of British history, Section 18 declares that there will be no debtors' prisons. Consistent with the U.S. Constitution, it says the military shall be under control of civilian power, and all elections shall be free. Trials by jury are guaranteed, as is the right to post bail. Here's an interesting one. Like the U.S. Constitution, the state constitution outlaws treason against the state of Arizona. I'm just not sure what would constitute treason against Arizona. Now, a couple of things consistent with the federal system. Arizona cannot confer royal titles and privileges. And over in the criminal justice system, if charged with a crime, the first step in the process must be to appear before a magistrate, that means a judge, for a preliminary examination or preliminary hearing to hear the charge and enter a plea. But here's one that has demanded particular attention in recent decades. Section 31, quote, "No law shall be enacted in this state limiting the amount of damages to be recovered for causing the death or injury of any person," end quote. Today this issue is called tort liability. A tort is when someone is injured or killed due to the negligence of another person. The person or their family can sue the alleged guilty party for money damages. Section 31 says that the amount of money to be paid is up to a jury, and no law may limit the amount of monies a jury can award. This provision was meant to protect injured or killed workers. It was part of the progressive and populist movement who viewed the employers, big business, the mines, and railroads, as the bad guys. The U.S. Constitution makes no mention of this issue at all. Article 3 of the Arizona Constitution is pretty simple. It's only one long sentence that says there will be 3 branches of government: the executive, the legislative, and judicial. Article 4 outlines Arizona's legislature. The provision is in 2 parts, and the first deals with what are called initiative and referendum. Initiative is a system wherein the citizens can circulate and sign petitions to put a proposed new law on the ballot for a vote at the general election. They, rather than the legislature, are initiating a new law. Referendum is when the members of the legislature don't want to enact a new law themselves, but refer it to a public vote to let the people decide. Initiative and referendum provisions came out of the populist movement starting around 1890 and intended to give the public a bigger say in government. A look at this U.S. map indicates that most states with this approach are in the West, where the progressive and populist movements were strong. Here, a century later, there are concerns that the initiative process is often abused.
You know, one of the things I think that has caused people to be concerned about the initiative process was it was intended as a way for the people to express their view. And in recent years, the last decade or so, initiatives tend to be funded by special interest groups or individuals with a fair amount of money. And so I think the question is whether the initiative process still represents, as it was intended to, the voice of the people and a direct democracy. I think there are substantial questions that we have to at least be willing to consider there.
Part 2 of Article 4 outlines the structure and operation of the legislature, and it's all very similar to how the U.S. Constitution outlines the U.S. Congress. Of course, there would be a House and a Senate. Now, in those days, the number of elected members was apportioned based on the population within counties. And it might surprise you to know that in the first election, the place with the biggest population and that got the most representatives wasn't Phoenix or Tucson. It was Bisbee, down in Cochise County, where the mining industry was booming. House and Senate members were elected for 2-year terms, and they still are. The governor and higher offices back then also had 2-year terms, but these days they get 4. The legislature was to meet every year in January. They were paid, I believe, $7 per day, which for 1912 wasn't bad. The downside was that the pay ran out after 60 days. Oh, they could stay in session longer if they wanted to, but it was on their own dime. By the way, the fact that state legislative sessions around the country typically begin in January has nothing to do with starting the calendar year off right. Rather, it was that a high percentage of American state legislators were farmers and ranchers. In January and February, the farm fields were covered with snow. It was a good time to be down at the state capitol. The idea was to have the state's business done by March or April, then get back home for plowing and planting or the spring roundup. But back